Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, I'm Martin Ballard, and would you believe this is episode 10 of this podcast series from one of the UK's biggest producers of pantomime and children's theatre, as the momentum for Panto 2021 continues to build.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
I hope you're well. I don't know about you, but I've already started counting down to Panto 2021 with fingers crossed. Now, in the previous episodes, we've taken you behind the scenes at Imagine Theatre. We've met directors, choreographers, lighting designers, and stars of Imagine Theatre shows like Eric Potts, Sam Bailey, and Ian Lachlan. Don't worry if you've missed any of the previous episodes, though, because they are still available. In episode 9, I spoke to the Copenhagen-based theatre director and writer Janice Dunn. This time, I've been joined by the Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Performance at the Victoria and Albert Museum. He's a fount of Panto knowledge, and his labour of love includes research interests in modern British pantomime, its evolution since 1945, and the genre's use of celebrity. He's also curator of the National Database of Pantomime Performance and founder and coordinator of National Panto Day. He is Simon Sladen. How are you, Simon?
Hello, Martin. Well, thank you very much for having me today.
First of all, V&A, you're in your office, presumably, in the inner sanctum there. What a great place to work.
Yes, although it's very quiet at the moment. But we're slowly seeing everybody coming back, which is wonderful. And yes, to work with the National Collection, where we have a whole host of pantomime material from Victorian and actually even earlier books of words, fragments of costumes, right up to material from the present day. We recorded, actually, Coventry's Panto a couple of years ago for the National Video Archive of Performance, which was wonderful to have that captured. And we're trying to get every single title ticked off the list so that future generations can watch some of that magic that comes to the stages each season.
Anybody who knows anything about your life, it's clear that theatre, and Panto perhaps in particular, has been a big influence on you from a very early age. I'm going to take you back to Littlehampton if I can, because I think that's where it all began. Even at school you were studying drama and amongst other things, but do you remember the first Panto you saw? Was that as a young child?
My grandma lived in Camberley and we used to go up and see her at Christmas. One year, she had a letter through the door from the new Victoria Theatre in Woking, which was just about to open, and there were some very good deals on the pantomime that year. So she decided, as I'm sure many people have that tradition, she was going to take all the children and all the grandchildren to the Panto. You know, it's a relatively large theatre, the new Victoria. It was brand new, wonderful, and actually we went to see Aladdin starring Danny LaRue as Widow Twankey, which was quite something. Now, I don't remember a great deal about the show apart from two things. One was that all of my aunties and uncles were very excited to see Danny LaRue, and I had no idea at the time who that was. And then there were a couple of scenes which I really remember. One was the stage at the end of Act 2 with the waterfall and the fountains, which just looked marvellous, that spectacle side. And the others was that the policemen in that production or a troupe of acrobats, as is so often the case. And they flew in a cloth that was floor to ceiling painted as washing machines. And what would happen in this musical number, which seemed to, go on for 10 minutes of wonderful excitement, behind and in front of that cloth, they would trampoline in and out of these painted washing machines through the doors. And it was wonderful because it was almost like synchronized swimming but at a 90-degree angle, and I just was absolutely astounded by that. Not only this sort of choreography coming on, but thinking, gosh, where are they going when they go into the washing machine, and how are they doing that? Because it seems like completely magic. And from that year on, we went every year.
Do you know, I saw something very similar in Robinson Crusoe at the Theatre Royal Nottingham when I was a child, and it was, I think they were called the Acromaniacs or something similar, and it was on the ship, and they had portholes, again painted into the cloth, and they would be trampolining in and out. Ken Dodd was the star of the show, and they had a double in the same costume, so it looked like Ken Dodd was doing all the same stunts, which was absolutely hilarious.
Amazing.
Danny LaRue, of course, legend of Panto and variety and all sorts of other things. A different sort of dame. You couldn't be further from Les Dawson or Norman Evans or somebody like that than Danny LaRue, and I suppose Kerry Dupree is the closest to that now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's always fascinated with me in pantomime is this notion of tradition. we often in our heads go, well, that's a traditional panto, or that's a traditional panto. And when you start unpeeling those layers, you realize that tradition is a wonderful word to use because it often means the pantos you grew up with or those that you've been most exposed to. So this notion of the dame always being, what many refer to as a fat bloke in a dress, actually Dan Leno, one of the most famous dames of Drury Lane, and actually that set many an archetype for dame moving forward. He certainly wasn't a fat bloke in a dress. He was quite short, he was slim, didn't play it in that over the top way. And as you said, we've had that tradition and trajectory with Les Dawson, going all the way back. I mean, Danny LaRue is interesting because this is where my celebrity sort of interest comes in, that suddenly along the history of pantomime, these big famous people from other performance genres or other entertainment forms come in, and suddenly producers put them in situations which other performers wouldn't be afforded. So Danny LaRue was not the only or first person to present this female impersonation style of dame, but I would argue, was the first to really popularize it and for other people to take it into a way that we've seen now. There's a whole school of daming, if you like, taking on this form of dame. Very different in the aspect of not that more bawdy, some might argue, humour. I mean, Les Dawson's humour, that whole Sissy and Ada, again, we see a transference from the television into that act there. But interestingly as well with Danny LaRue, a lot of those shows in the early days that Danny was doing panto did have another, let's call it more mumsy dame in there as well, playing maybe the Queen Mother or roles like that. And I think that's what's really interesting, seeing that evolution of the form, because pantomime has evolved and stays relevant because of its willingness to embrace change and also steal a bit from everywhere. So Augustus Harris at Drury Lane, the 1880s onwards, he wasn't the first to start employing music hall stars, but of course a theatre as big as Drury Lane meant that he could attract the biggest stars of the day, and so you have them integrated. And that's where we really start to see celebrities channeling their onstage or on-screen persona through the roles. And anybody that's seen a pantomime with a celebrity or a well-known person today will know that it constantly oscillates in playing between, is that the person on the stage playing a character? Is that an actor? Or is it them in their role as a character? And I think probably the most prime example of that would be Pamela Anderson playing the genie, coming on board in a sparkly red swimsuit on a surfboard, alluding to Baywatch. But that, I think, is part of what we enjoy. We want that shared recognition of, oh, I know that person from so-and-so. And it would be odd not to acknowledge that in some way, because I think as everybody involved in the industry will say, the audience is the final character as part of the cast. And if you ignore that body of knowledge that they bring to the show, especially a show that relies on and expects participation, that's where a show can go terribly wrong. And I've been in many shows that are almost on autopilot and forget, they might leave a 2-second gap after saying hi, you boys and girls, and it's on. And of course, after about a quarter of the way through, the audience folds their arms, sit back and goes, okay, well, I'm not even going to bother then. I'll just watch this. I may as well have gone to a musical.
No, you're absolutely right. I think as well, the interesting thing for me is the only tradition of panto that is worth remembering is that anything is possible, and that every performer, speciality act, whoever they might be, brings something of themselves to the show. And that's when panto is at its best. It is, variety with a storyline for many people. You probably know this one, but I heard tales years ago of, in Cinderella or a similar pantomime, Mrs. Mills was appearing back in the 60s, and at one point the fireplace opened, a piano appeared, and she played a few tunes.
Yes, absolutely. Cinderella's, I've heard of Priscilla the Goose taking their head off, and the famous lines that have been attributed to lots of different people. Oh dear, I'm here, I'm all alone. Perhaps I'll play my xylophone. I think it was the Chuckle Brothers that said that you can sort of do any scene by adding a line. For example, they used to do a scene in Cinderella where someone would go, do the washing up and don't drop any plates, and you cue the whole plate smashing scene there. I think that is one of the wonders, is that as a form that does rely on a well-known narrative, actually we all know those stories in our head, so it's very easy to be quite light on peppering those points of plot throughout the show. But also, because of its influence, is dating way back to commedia dell'arte in an improvised form, bits of circus, bits of mumming. We also anticipate that. And actually, in contemporary pantomime, is one of the only areas you'll see some of these historic popular entertainment pieces and forms. So it's not a museum piece. It's something that evolves but embraces that, and is one of the only places you'll see many of those forms still alive on the stage and still relevant. There's something wonderful about slapstick. There's something wonderful about physical comedy. And of course, if you are young and you might not be listening into it in the same way because your language skills are not there and you're growing up, the notion of something very visual means that you can enjoy it just as much as Granny and Grandad, who are enjoying those verbal dexterity of the double entendres or some of the other references that are in there. So it works very, very cleverly to such a wide cross-section of audiences.
You talked about the role of celebrity in the British panto industry, and that was your PhD. But before then, from GCSE right the way through to degree, you combined a couple of things that I think are really interesting: drama and German. And I love the playwright Bertolt Brecht, for instance, but that couldn't be further from panto, could it really? So what was the interest there?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You
mean you don't know?
Well, I can hazard an answer for you. It was interesting at our school. We had a very good drama department, and there was always a play, a musical, a concert, this. So we were very, very much encouraged. And I'm sure, like many people, my first way through to pantomime was through amateur dramatics, and we have a wonderful society in Littlehampton called the Littlehampton Musical Comedy Society, and each year you do a panto, you do a musical, and then you'd also do a sort of review show. And that's sort of where I sort of started to, I suppose, hone things a little bit more when I was given the opportunity to, be in them and write and things. But German, at my school, you either had to do French or German, and you didn't get to choose. It was depending on which bit of the year you were in, as you were split into two groups. And then it was an opportunity to go abroad. I'd never been abroad before then. And I just got really excited about learning other cultures and learning the language. And it went from there, really. I suppose part of it was, is there a job at the end of drama? But, there might be in German. And I was very interested in translation and those cultural nuances. Everything that I've done absolutely involved with pantomime and its exploration of Britishness and a very British form, and particularly with German and the other things that I do within the museum, have always been about, how does a culture manifest itself? Where can you find a culture? And I would argue there's no better arena in which to really examine a culture than the arts, and particularly in performance, and particularly in any performance that has been afforded the phrase popular entertainment, comedy, because they really are of the now. They capture the presence, and often they're a form that don't really hold back on a number of things. Now, the German thing is interesting because, yes, Brecht is completely, in many ways, a number of ways, world. However, the Verfremdungseffect, where the alienation effect, however you want to describe it, about reminding people they're in the theatre and being there. Actually, pantomime in some ways does a similar thing. You're always reminded at certain points that you're there and you can join in, and that we stop the action for this happening, or a cod corpse happens, and we're reminded of the theatre, and we see things going wrong and we enjoy that, or someone's picked out of the audience. So there is a sort of reminder of that, what we might call the shared community of Panto Land, but also that we know that it's sort of also straddling the world of the performance that's going on, the world of pantomime, the world of reality, particularly celebrity, again, as a vehicle to do that, where we're constantly making allusions to things outside of that realm. And of course, everybody does love it when something goes wrong, even if those of us with the industry can see when something's going to go wrong about 2 minutes beforehand, because there's a wonderful setup. But most people don't necessarily see 20 plus shows a year. So, of course, by the time the Cinderella comes through the second time round after a 5-year cycle, you probably can't remember all the ins and outs. And it might be that it's a new production company, or it might be, a tailored script and things. So, yeah, I suppose German and drama slightly separated, although there have been some pantomimes in Germany, and that was something I got quite excited about when I was certainly doing my undergraduate, how they adapted the form, and also even tried to get to grips with the form, having not been brought up on it. And I remember seeing some footage of Der gestiefelte Kater, so the Puss in Boots, and a lot of the characters were suddenly coming on as from Star Trek, because obviously they were updating it amazingly. And I think that's the one thing that we don't do very well in this country. You go back to the Victorian era, and in a production of Jack and the Beanstalk, they're building a train to get to Mars and things like that, and we think, God, that sounds just crazy. That's not the traditional story. And of course, around the world where they do Panto, they're not constrained by our form that we've developed. So, for example, they'll go a bit more out there with bringing in things that we go, well, that's not very traditional. Like Wild Rice, a company in Singapore, do great productions where they're very sort of localized and bring on some of the local cultures. And so, they've done a production of Jack and the Beansprout, for example, or in South Africa, we'll have local things. And that is another one of the real key aspects, that localization, which is so key to that community. And any of the people listening that have seen a local panto will get all of the references and all the jokes, no matter how subtle or small or a one-liner they are. You go in as an outsider and try and get to understand a show or see where those references are coming. It's very, very alienating, because you suddenly feel, this isn't the culture that I grew up in, or I don't know about the one-way system in this town. I don't know who that person is that they've just told me about. And yet everyone's laughing and joining in.
The more I think about it, I don't want to go on about Brecht too much, but when you look at the Berliner Ensemble, you've even got the celebrity aspect with Lotte Lenya and people like that. So maybe there are comparisons, and that's the beauty of theatre generally, isn't it? Interesting you talk about Germany and Singapore and other places, because you have done some lecture work in the United States, in Syracuse, and I wonder what they make of Panto over there when you try to explain it to them.
It's funny, with the American students, I show them clips and then get them to write sort of a short review. But they love it. I mean, firstly, the whole explosion of colour and the slapstick thing stands out. But secondly, the additional characters. So one of the other areas of my research is certainly looking at this evolution since the war and the impact Disney's had. We don't really acquire knowledge of the stories, of the fairy tale stories, through Brothers Grimm anymore. Most of it is through watching a Disney film or Disney cartoon. And so naturally, those archetypes of characters, of plot points all come from there. So they get quite excited by those extra characters, such as Buttons, for example, who aren't in those stories but bring something new to the narrative. And of course, one of the key things is that audience participation that we spoke of earlier. It's quite alien to a lot of people, that form, because for lots of people, you go to the theatre, you shut up, you sit down, and you don't even open your Maltesers in case you rustle the box. Whereas at pantomime, you're not only invited to, it's obligatory, because if you don't shout out where that lamp is, Aladdin's never going to get out of that cage. Cage, that's a very different version. Cave. It's quite serious, that way that interaction is used in that way. Over the last decade, there have been more pantos popping up in America. Bonnie Lithgow has been producing pantos there, which then do what often happened, tour then to Australia. Canada's had a long tradition of pantomimes that would go over there. Lionel Blair used to do many a show over there after doing the production in the UK and with Paul Elliott's shows. So there are pockets generally where there has been a British presence, or there is a British presence now. But it's certainly, I remember taking a group of students when they were over to Hackney Empire to see the show. And after a little bit of, oh gosh, what on earth is going on here? This is a very interesting situation because of the audience that's completely all different ages and backgrounds, and people getting ready. They've all got their programs, all excited. The overture happens, and then the show starts. But the fact that you can join in, and if you don't know, I mean, it's a bit like church. You never taught when to join in, but you sort of know what to do when. It's the same with pantomime, really. You acquire it only through going. So if you haven't ever been, one of my colleagues at the museum had never seen a panto before. She was German. And we took her to a panto. And then she's introduced that tradition to her daughter. But it's lovely to think that there is something about the genre which, because it's only generally on at one time a year. Yes, we have summer pantos, we have Easter pantos, but generally that Christmas season is the biggest. That it does allow for that marker in the calendar for you to get together with everyone, which is why we're so fingers crossed looking forward to this season ahead of us at the moment, having
absolutely
really have one last year, and get together as a community, because there are very few times when people from across the community come together in one place under one roof to do one thing to watch the show, and whether that's family communities, friendship communities, work communities, geographic communities. The pantomime really is one of those areas of civic pride and a civic moment for everybody to come together.
I think perhaps more than ever before as well, it is an open door, that immediate access for people who wouldn't ordinarily go into a theatre ever, to go in and to actually think this place is for me.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard done by to find someone in the profession that didn't see a panto as one of their first things they ever saw and wasn't transfixed by it and thought, gosh, this is the world that I want to, to go into. That moment at Christmas is very special as well. It's colder, everyone's got their coats on, their scarves, and you go into this warm building, all the ushers being smiley and friendly. You're lucky because you get to have a program. You might get some popcorn or sweets or something. You're there with everybody, especially if you're with your mates at school and you're all going in and you don't even have to be in school at the matinee or something. I mean, that's really exciting. And it's a safe space, it's a friendly space, it's a fun space. You're not told off, you're encouraged to join in. And as you said, it's an important thing to encourage people into the theatre. They might see other things there. They might go to musical, they might go to play, the ballet, the opera. Even if they just go, oh, they do really good coffee, and I'm going to go there all the time to support the theatres, because more than ever, we need to get people back into the theatres. We need to get them supporting pantomime and everything else. And pantomime plays a very different role in terms of the theatre ecology in our country, because it is often the thing that subsidises the theatre for the rest of the year. One of the really striking things coming out of last year, when many, many, many shows could not go ahead, was that venues were revealing how much they relied on the pantomime to help fund the rest of the year. And it goes from about 8 or 9% up to 52% some venues.
Yeah.
And that shows us how embedded that is into the theatrical landscape. Because if you started today and you went, I'm going to do something for 6 weeks of the year that's worth 51% of the income of the theatre that supports everything else, you'd go, my goodness, what about a snowy winter? What if something, what if it's a bad season? You just wouldn't put all your eggs in that basket. And I think that's why it's been so great to see what's happened in terms of the streaming that happened last year. A number of venues saying they're still going to do that, because not everybody can get to the show, and not everybody can afford to see the show in the venue. But it certainly made everybody think about pantomime's position within the programming of venues.
So when did the writing begin then? Because I mentioned before, Panto editor for the British Theatre Guide and, of course, Panto Day and so on. But you've been writing scripts for 20 years or so, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, it makes me sound like a bit like a Panto rebel. So why did I start writing scripts? Well, when I was doing my A-level, I did English language. And we had to do a piece of creative writing. And my teacher said something like, one day, like many of us have heard in the industry, well, there's no point writing a pantomime because they're all the same every year and it's pretty basic, and put it on, slap bash, that's it. Now, everybody listening to this loves pantomime. We know that that's not the case, but there is still a certain area of the media and of the population that don't go to pantomimes that sprout this nonsense every year. And so I saw that as my challenge to write the first act, because of the word length, of a mixed up panto. Then I went, right, well, I've done that, and I'm going to put it on at school, because sadly there was a big change in staffing and there was no school plays anymore, and it went down very well. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. That's when I started playing with the form in terms of how far can you go before people go, oh, that's a bit different to what the usual one is. So that's where that started, and then I started to get the opportunity to write at Littlehampton Musical Comedy Society, and then when I was at university, and then I had a few published as a result of that, mainly because I also worked for Stagecoach, so I was teaching drama and needed a show that had 40, 50 people in, all with named parts. So I used the form there to do what we love about Panto, have the pop hits of the year and classics from yesteryear in it that everybody knows. So it's really great to have those musical numbers. It's much easier to learn, but also have a show that everybody could have a part in, and a named part, and that you could do that very easily without having to go down Villager 1 to 34. So I wrote a version of Cinderella where the fairy godmother was in the final stages of training for a whole group of fairies, and each of them had specialities. So one of them was good in transformations, one was good at gardening, and so you can see how very nicely that all comes together. And then my academic writing in a similar way began, because I was doing a course at Royal Holloway on theatre criticism and reviews, and that was great with a wonderful academic called Karen Fricker. And it was in the autumn term, and we used to go and see a show a week and write about it. And then our final week, which was in that December period, was free choice. So she said, you can choose whatever you want. Annoyingly, we're doing the course this term. This means there's not much on, really. I mean, there's a few pantos you could go to, but you can't really write anything interesting about them. And I was like, aha, there's another opportunity for me to defy you. And so I actually wrote the review, and that's how I got involved with the British Theatre Guide, because she kindly put me in touch with them. And that's also where I started writing academically about panto, and seeing that not many people had really delved into particularly contemporary pantomime. And then I went on from there and did as my dissertation, and then, kept going until just published a piece about the influence of drag artists in pantomime, particularly the role that we've seen develop over the past 3-4 years of the drag villain coming in. So yeah, always the case. I suppose I pride what I do on the positive promotion of pantomime. That's why I started Panto Day in the National Database and the Panto Advice page. And it's great that this podcast is happening with all such wonderful people, because popular entertainment forms traditionally don't get captured or archived because there is not the structures there to do so. And often, if you think of circus, people are traveling around, there's not much space, there's not much money, people wear the same costumes, pass them down, there's a big oral tradition. And actually what's been great over the last 10 years is that people have really woken up and intervened to try and capture that heritage, because there's big swathes of it that we've just lost. And certainly I feel very lucky that I saw people like Danny LaRue, people like John Inman, that at the V&A we were able to capture Roy Hard and Jack Tripp and their performance of Babes in the Woods for the archive, because otherwise it's lost forever, and we just have these wonderful stories and these wonderful anecdotes of people. But it's so important for us to be able to engage with culture and history, to know where we're from, to inspire new work and evolutions, and really help us ground us in that tradition, because it is such an important part of our cultural heritage, and it's intrinsic to not only that cultural aspect, but as we were talking about earlier, to that business side of things as well.
So 3 final questions, Simon. I've been asking all of the guests the same thing. The first one is, of all the Panto titles, which is your personal favourite?
So my personal favourite, I would say, is Dick Whittington, because it gives you so much scope. You can start off on land, you go over the sea, or however you like to, maybe in the air, and you go to somewhere else. Now, traditionally, you start off in London, and then you go across water, and you get shipwrecked, and you turn up somewhere, often Morocco. Today, of course, you might end up in Iceland, or you might end up in the Antarctic, or you might fly to that place. So I think that is a story that lets people really put their mark on it. So I would say Dick Whittington, although I have to say I've read many a script in my time, and I'm still waiting for the day that I see my first Little Bo Peep, a show which hasn't had a professional version for at least 40 years. We're seeing Humpty Dumpty next year at Newcastle, so that'll be the first time in about 30 or so. But yeah, with all the Easter pantos that are now happening across the country, it seems perfectly appropriate for that. And also another great show with a strong female lead. So I would like, if producers are listening, I'd like to throw down the gauntlet to see that revived at some point within the next 5
absolutely
years.
And we are losing so many titles, which is a shame, until Disney turn them into an animated feature, and then they'll of course come back. I've been excited about this because you said to me that you had a great story to tell. When it comes to things going wrong, when was it not all right on the night?
A few things come to mind. I've lost count of the number of times there's been a fire alarm and we've all gone outside, which is hilarious, and seeing the miniature ponies being brought outside and it almost becoming a nice little petting zoo at schools performances. I've also seen a number of lighting rigs fail, which is really a challenge for everybody on the stage. But the one I'm going to talk about is one that I know probably a few people listening may have also experienced. And I don't know actually, Martin, if you've ever heard of this. I know you've been in this title. So Peter Pan is regarded as many as the unlucky pantomime because of everybody's bad experiences with it. And I have seen this myself, and I know a number of people have seen it at other shows as well, because of course you've got lots of children in, you've potentially got animals or people playing an animal, and you've got quick changes of scenery from different types of locations. You've got somebody who doesn't have both uses of their hand because they're wearing a hook at one thing, so lots of things could go wrong. Of course, you've also got flying. The children and Wendy are wearing often long white nighties, all the rest of it. There's a production where they're flying and they're doing sort of loop the loops, lovely. Oh dear, somebody's got a nosebleed. And unfortunately, the nosebleed then, as they're doing these loop-de-loops, is running all over this lovely white garment. So it looks like that somebody's been sort of shot in the air as they're sort of flying along. And of course, there's only a few bars of music left, so nobody wants to bring the child down because, of course, it will completely ruin the whole illusion of the show. At the same time, all the kids in the audience have been stuffing their faces with sweets, are constantly like looking up and looking down and looking around. And there becomes this bout of vomiting in the stalls because they've all been like, their gullet has been moving up and down as they've been ingesting goodness knows how many sweets and sugars. So we've got blood and nose on the stage going through and up in the sky in the flying scene from London, and then in the stalls we've just got vomiting everywhere. So I mean, that is a very unfortunate incident, and it doesn't happen that often.
Can you sort of sum up why Panto is so special for you?
And I think it goes back to what I said earlier. For me, Panto is so special for a number of things. One, it's often somebody's first experience of the theatre, so it plays a really key role in our cultural landscape, in that foot into, whether it's the theatre, whether it's music, whether it's art, you're often taken to it. So it's not a choice you've made, you're taken to it and then you get taken to this world. Secondly, it's a great way to analyse culture. If you think what's special about the pantomime that sets it apart from most other things, it's like a living newspaper of the year. And so for me, as a curator and as an academic, if I take, let's say, 10 Dick Whittingtons, one a year for the past 10 years, it's a slice of culture in that place at that time for that audience. And that's so valuable as a resource. And thirdly, we should be really proud of a form that's developed and evolved, that is peculiarly, British in the way that it is, and that plays such a fundamental role in so many people's lives. And I think for that, that's something amazing. There are very, very, very few forms that evolve and survive over centuries. And pantomime has, because it's willing to change.
It's interesting you should say that, because evolution is key. And my final question was going to be, given everything that you've done and everything that you've spoken about, times change, people change, celebrities that come into Panto are now coming from reality television, whereas they would have come in from music hall or whatever previously. The whole way that society is changing. I know that you've looked at casting practices and particularly relating to race and ethnicity. Where is Panto going to go from here? Do you think we will see some major changes?
I think a number have already happened. 10% of principal boys now are played by a female performer. It's a big change, certainly since the 80s. This sort of started to begin in the 90s. We've seen a lot of narratives change in terms of the princess character, much less passive, responding to the times. I think that's where pantomime really needs to address what it's doing. It's inherited its Victorian practice, particularly in terms of performers of colour. We need to end performers of colour only being cast as fairies or villains, further othering. We need to see better casting in terms of people with disabilities on the stage. Because pantomime has this huge diverse audience, that diversity currently isn't reflected on the stage. Talented performers are out there, whether they're performers of colour, whether they're performers with disabilities, whether they're one thing that I wrote about a few years about a lot was about female comics, of which there are very, very few. The talent is out there. It's just that producers and writers need to be confident in casting people to do those roles because audiences want them and they expect them. What are we going to do about Aladdin? What are we going to do about representation there? We really need to start addressing that. We've seen a number of productions which have embraced gay relationships and lesbian relationships, really important in that respect. And I would hope that those scripts that are used and tweaked for the celebrity or tweaked for whatever, this year that we've just had, hopefully people have actually gone, let's start anew, let's refresh and write this. So it is up to the larger producers to really look at their previous practice and go, why have we never ever cast a performer with a disability? Why are we not doing what other venues are and having integrated sign language into our productions? Why have we never had a black performer as our principal boy or girl? I mean, these things should not be happening today. So those things need to be addressed, and also some of the aspects of stories need to be addressed. I mentioned Dick Whittington because I'm always excited to see how people get around or review the aspect of Morocco that often is incredibly orientalist and very offensive in the portrayal of other cultures. What can we do to ensure that that does not other the culture? How can we ensure that people, for example, from those regions of the world do not feel that they're being represented in a negative or racist way? But certainly we need to look to people that are really pushing forward in the genre. Like Johnny McKnight at Tron Theatre Glasgow, who's doing some amazing things there. Productions such as Chick Whittington, the recent Cinderella, which flipped a lot of characters' genders. We should look to what the queer community is doing with some of the queer pantos in really interesting things about changing genders, changing some of the narratives a bit, and it makes it less misogynistic. It gets rid of racist tones. It gets rid of all of that aspect. It's just being bold to do what I said earlier is in reference to that Victorian one. If you were going to throw what you feel is tradition out the window and embrace a train going to Mars in Jack and the Beanstalk, which the Victorians absolutely did, that's what we need to do, because this standardization is stifling creativity and is also stifling representation.
Just one extra thing on that, because, and you mentioned Disney, and Disney have actually changed what they're doing now. You're seeing gay characters, you're seeing female protagonists, and a better ethnic mix in stuff that they're doing. And I just wonder whether you think the restriction is the story itself, because that's always going to be divisive if you start changing characters and people come to see it. Some will love it, some will say, actually, it doesn't work for me. I wonder whether you think we might need new stories introduced.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the history of the genre, it has gone in waves. I mean, now Snow White and Peter Pan are frequently the most produced, and people would say, "Oh, they're not pantomimes." I mean, they don't adhere to those traditional forms. And Rapunzel has certainly been has come onto the scene since Tangled, and certainly last year should have been, but this year coming up, Beauty and the Beast was really, really very, very popular in terms of that because of the release of the Disney film. I think it might be a case of changing those stories. The stories that we know and love have gone through a number of changes over the years. I do think that there are opportunities for new stories, or stories that we don't quite know as well, be they Mother Goose, be they Goldilocks, which we've seen a sort of resurgence of a bit since the Palladium. I mean, interestingly, I've noted a number of shows in the last 3 years that actually don't have a romance in them. They get rid of that, and it's all about working together or working as a team, whether it's brother or sister, whether it's friends. So I think we are slowly seeing that. We're also seeing a very different relationship with magic because of this notion of, previously it was about, you might have magical intervention, so, be a good person and you'll get that. Now, I think very much in the Britain that we live in, it's much a case of you need to work hard, you need to get there on your own, and so those principal characters are certainly doing that. There's much less magical intervention these days. Beric Kayla said it, and Michael Harrison more recently. In many of our venues, we could put on the Yellow Pages, the pantomime, and people would come because they know pantomime. They know the key characters. They know some of the performers that come back year on year. So, that creativity that affords you can be quite exciting, but it is risky.
Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Simon. Thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to Panto Day 2021. Have you got the date?
Well, the date will be shared with everybody very, very soon. But I should say I'm very pleased to be the 10th podcast because it is 10th anniversary of Panto Day this year.
Oh, fantastic.
So 10s across the board.
How fitting is that? Listen, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Next time I'll be talking to the actor, musician, director, singer and musical director Stephen Wren. Now don't forget you can subscribe through your favourite podcast app. Make sure you do that now and join me, Martin Ballard. I'll see you next time for episode 11 of Just Imagine.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.